This episode is being brought to you by Real-Time CTMS, a leading provider of innovative software solutions for clinical trial research sites, site networks, sponsors, and CROs. Real-time systems allow users to manage complex clinical research processes with powerful, user-friendly interfaces that are revolutionizing how research gets done. I personally love Real-Time CTMS because they have a great recruitment portal. It helps us track all the financials for our studies to ensure that we are not out a dime from the sponsors. And also helps make sure we keep our visits within window. To get a free demo, visit the company's website at realtime-ctms.com and fill out one of the contact forms. Hello and welcome to the Note to File podcast, a collection of interviews, best practices, and candid commentary for clinical research sites. I'm your host, Brad Hightower, founder of Hightower Clinical, where we provide cost-free research infrastructure to physicians so that they can participate in clinical trials without any increased burden on their practice. To find out more, visit us at hightowerclinical.com. For episode show notes, transcripts, and guest contact information, please visit notetofilepodcast.com. Our guest today is Richie Kahn. Richie is a health policy professional by training, a clinical researcher by trade, and a patient advisor by necessity. He's passionate about incorporating patient and caregiver perspectives into the clinical development process and ultimately reducing the time it takes to bring promising new therapeutics and diagnostics to market. In this episode, we discuss what clinical trials can learn from public health, the importance of community engagement, and the ongoing role of technology in clinical trials. Without further ado, Richie Kahn. All right, Richie Kahn, thanks so much for coming on today, sir.
Thanks, Brad. Appreciate the opportunity to chat with you.
Awesome. I love it. I know we've sort of been stalking each other's LinkedIn a little bit here and there and, liking each other's content. So I'm glad to finally have you on. And as always, I like to start kind of by hearing people's origin stories in clinical research. I find such a interesting and diverse ways people come in, oftentimes by accident. And I think that can be really instructive to other people looking to get into the industry, or at the very least, they can relate to people who have otherwise stumbled in accidentally. So tell us a little bit about your clinical research story.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I am definitely a consummate stumbler. I was working in public health at a nonprofit in the hepatitis B space. I'm a public health person by training. My focus is really on health policy and management. And I was doing my thing, enjoyed the work very much, started dating someone, and I had a feeling that we were maybe going to get serious. She also worked in public health, teaching sex ed to Philadelphia public school students. So I put two and two together, and I started wondering if 2 public health salaries would pay my student loans and be coming due in about 6 months. And I decided one night I'd get some pizza, get some beer, and sit down in front of the computer, and I'd try to look for a way to apply the skills I had picked up in public health and the frame for viewing the world to something maybe a little more lucrative. And this was back in the day when you could actually find jobs in clinical research on Craigslist, right? And I started seeing a whole host of terms I was unfamiliar with. I mean, starting with clinical research, moving into patient recruitment and feasibility. So I had 15 different tabs open. And the more I learned about each of these areas, the more I said, you know what? What drew me to research is actually what drew me to public health before it, right? Which was the ability to impact multiple patient lives at once. I come from a family of clinicians, nurses. I used to volunteer in the back of an ambulance, and I knew as passionate as I was about healthcare, that one-to-one treatment probably wasn't the avenue I was looking to pursue. So I learned about health policy, I learned about research, and I said, okay, this might be an opportunity for me. And I filled out a job application for a contract feasibility and patient recruitment gig at the old Accurian before they were acquired by PPD and became AES. And I remember when I left the interview a couple of weeks later, they said, we didn't really understand what public health was all about. We thought we needed somebody with a clinical background for this role, an old NP, PA, maybe a foreign MD. But now we understand what public health can bring to the table, and I think would be a great fit. And that's how I've sort of framed looking at the industry ever since. Public health is one of these areas where you can kind of write your own ticket, define your own path. And that's what I've done since getting into the industry. So stumbled into it very quickly, focused on a number of different avenues really aimed at accelerating the time it takes to bring promising new therapies to the patients in need of most. So things like patient recruitment and feasibility, of course, making sure protocols are actually feasible to recruit for is in making sure there's patient interest. And more recently, sort of the intersection of research and technology, making sure those protocols are as free of unnecessary barriers to participation as possible, working to democratize access to research and bring in studies to that 70% of the population in the US that is more than 2 hours away from a traditional trial site. So that's how I started out in research. Now, 12 years later, I'm working over at Medable as Senior Director of Patient Success, where I am squarely focused on incorporating the patient and caregiver perspective into the products we design and the trials we support.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. I do want to go a little bit more into your role at Medable, but before that, I'm kind of curious, and this is a little bit of a conversation I've had in the past. I have someone on my team who has a public health background as well. When I hear public health, it seems like kind of a nebulous term. I'm not sure what it entails. It sounds like it entails a lot of different things, possibly. So I guess what can you tell me about maybe the intersection of public health and clinical trials, and maybe what sorts of things that clinical trials can learn from the public health field? I'm kind of under the impression that there's some great takeaways or maybe some different approaches that public health takes that it may incorporate well into clinical trials. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad to see that you've already picked up on the benefits of adding someone with a public health background to the team. Admittedly, public health as an industry, we don't do a great job of really publicizing what we do well, and how it can complement healthcare more broadly, medicine, clinical research. There are a couple super quick takeaways and avenues for applying lessons learned in public health to clinical research, and some of them are finally becoming commonplace now. So public health, perfect example, my first job in the industry, I was really working to build awareness in addition to doing education and advocacy outreach for patients or family members and clinicians involved in the hepatitis B space. And public health, there's a lot of on the ground building connections in the community. This is the Hepatitis B Foundation. This is our mission. This is why we're doing what we're doing. And a lot of those skills are transferable to patient recruitment. So I remember one of the tasks I was faced with was getting 300 people lined up in Northeast Philadelphia for hepatitis B screening. So in the Philadelphia area, the groups most commonly impacted are either Asian Pacific Islander immigrants or West African immigrants. And the problem with hepatitis B, like hepatitis C, is you usually don't know you have it because you're asymptomatic until it's too late, right? So we said, okay, there is a very large Korean American community in Northeast Philadelphia. We know hepatitis B has been a problem in the past there. Let's start talking to trusted community members. Started having conversations with the minister of a very large congregation, and we sat down one day. We were explaining, why we wanted to chat with him, why we thought there'd be some benefit of getting his congregation screened. And he said, yeah, no, this makes total sense. Come back in 3 weeks. And we did. I think we stopped at Dunkin' Donuts to get coffee and everything on the way. And by the time we got there, he had already set up coffee and snacks. There were 300 people lined up, right? But when we talk about patient recruitment, the vast majority of patients are coming from outside of your practice right now. So where do they come from? By and large, they're coming from the community. So it's all about building those connections, generating awareness of, my name is Brad. I run Hightower Clinical. We're a member of your community. Here's what we do. These are some of the trials we have coming up, so the community knows about you. They can learn a little bit more about clinical research and the protections in place to keep patients safe. So ultimately, it's a lot easier to connect with patients looking to participate. It's the on the ground, going to the barbershop, the community center, the health clinic, just building those relationships so people know this is not a purely transactional thing. It's a two-way street. You're looking to help people improve their lives. And that's, I guess, the biggest thing that I bring from my background in public health research. I'm glad to see we're doing more of that now. There's an awareness that we have to focus on the health of populations. Ultimately, clinical research is designed to bring therapies to a larger group than we study in clinical trials. But if we want to make sure the medications being developed apply across the board, and we know how they impact disparate demographics and populations, we need to build relationships with those groups and get them involved in research.
Yeah, and that's a refrain. I mean, I've had all across this podcast, and everyone I talk to, I think community engagement, and I love that you use the term transactional. These are not just transactional relationships. These are true true relationships that you have to build within your community and get your community engaged. And that helps with the whole education aspect, because, it's not just lack of awareness of the existence, but it's just the education about what a clinical trial is, why they're doing clinical trials, what sorts of risks are involved, why it's safe or not safe, and all of these things. And I think that's sometimes underappreciated at a site level. And then that might be a good segue to talk about kind of the role you have now with, I guess, what you would ostensibly call a decentralized trial company, which is sort of taking a little bit of a different approach than your traditional site model. So tell me a little bit about your role there and how that may differ from how standalone sites often operate.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll back up and I'll frame this out. I think if there's one silver lining to the pandemic as it relates to clinical research, we are realizing that the usual way of doing business is not the only way. Certainly, last March, it wasn't even feasible, right? You had an entire group of studies that were going on where patients could not afford to have continuity of care interrupted. But for very valid and reasonable reasons, they didn't feel safe going to a large academic medical center. Maybe they didn't feel comfortable leaving their house, in the throes of the pandemic. And we had to think on our toes, right? We were definitely an industry comfortable doing things the same way over and over because it's easy. We know what results we're going to get, irrespective of if they're good or bad. But that wasn't an option. So over at Medable, they said, look, we have this entire decentralized clinical trial platform so patients can participate from home. They can fill out ePros. They can do a number of different things there. But the one aspect we've not fully baked and rolled out yet is our televisit platform specific to clinical trials, telemedicine for clinical trials. And we were working with a large oncology program at the time, doing a lot of work in Italy, and the patient population could not afford that disruption in care. So we worked very closely with that team. We were able to roll out a study-specific customized solution, and I think about 7 or 8 business days, and we were able to maintain that continuity of care and kind of show everybody, look, there was a way to continue conducting research in the pandemic. And what was really cool about that was every single solution that we deploy is developed not only with the patient in mind, but with patient and caregiver and care partner insight and input into the development. So with that said, I had been working with the Medable team for about 1.5 years, a little bit longer, as a member of the Patient Advisory Council. So I was telling you, Brad, I started out in public health. I was working all across clinical research in a number of different roles, site, CRO, tech companies. Pre-pandemic, I was working at an ophthalmology CRO, developing devices for the eye, medications and diagnostics as well, when I found out I was actually losing my own vision. So I kind of said, okay, maybe I can turn these lemons into lemonade. I can get back to my passion for advocacy and public health. And I decided I had a couple main goals, right? Number one, as you were talking about earlier, awareness is huge, or lack thereof, in clinical research. Awareness that it's an option, awareness that it's an avenue for clinicians to connect into their course of practice. So if I could build awareness of clinical research as a care option, that was my first goal. The second one was building awareness for the importance of getting screened for symptom-free vision loss. I really had relatively few signs and symptoms until I had lost almost half of my eyesight, believe it or not. And last but not least, as a former patient recruitment guy, I'm familiar with the stats. 86% of trials fail to meet timelines, right? And the largest delays are due to patient recruitment issues. I kind of said, well, if we can do a better job to methodically incorporate patient and caregiver perspective into everything we're doing in industry to remove burdens and make it easier to participate, then it feels like a win-win overall, right? I can turn this bad thing into a good thing. So that's how I got connected with Medable. And after working with the team for 1.5 years or so, there was an opportunity to come on board full time. So I did. April 1st of this year, came on board as the Senior Director of Patient Success. So I work with our networks of patients and caregivers. I do a lot of user experience research, a lot of user acceptance testing, dabbling a bit in devices and wearables and accessibility as well. But the idea is to make sure that every trial we support and every technology we're proposing really is created with the patient and the end user in mind, right? To make their experience a more positive one in clinical trials.
Yeah, so I love that. I think, so much of the people I talk to are sort of, again, site level. So I guess to take that even a step further, what you're doing and, what Medable is doing is my hat's off, a testament to actually putting your money where your mouth is. Because I think this is a patient centricity, something that sort of gets, bandied about a lot, but I don't know that we always truly see that in action. And I would maybe turn the question around to say, from your experience, what can sites do at their level to help include the patient perspective? Or maybe what are some lessons you've learned that sort of trickle down to the site level activities in terms of the patient interaction? Is there anything that jumps out to you that maybe we can do better at a site level as well?
Yeah, so let me frame it differently, I guess, here. I'm sort of the guy wagging my finger in all the phone calls at Medable saying, look, DCTs are great, but technology is not going to be a be-all, end-all solution. It's not going to be a silver bullet, right? We can't pretend that by saying, look, we've got all this flexibility, you can bring your own device, and then requiring an iPhone 13 and high-speed internet, that's not going to inadvertently narrow the patient population. So I'm very pragmatic on that front. But I'm also very pragmatic with the realization that I imagine the experience a lot of sites have, and it's been 5-6 years since I was on the site side of things at Benchmark Research. They're often told about removing patient burdens and making it easier to participate in research. And the end result is all of these companies are removing burdens from patients and inadvertently keeping them upon the sites, right? So I think what's really important is when you're able to actually share that perspective of what things are like at a clinical trial site. And what I mean by that is logistically, when you're working with a company and they're deploying 100 e-diaries and phones and medications being sent to the site, they often don't have a clear sense of the layout of a site. They don't know how much storage room you have, right? So if you can sort of work with them to educate so they've got a better sense of the needs you have, the constraints you have, the challenges you face, I think that's all helpful. It's going to ultimately lead to the development of more site-friendly products. I think that's really helpful. And then, just being really realistic with some of these organizations as well and saying, look, we put patients first, absolutely. But just so you understand, 90% of sites or whatever the stat is these days, if you don't pay us, we have enough money in the bank to keep the lights on for 30 days. So it doesn't matter how patient-centric and patient-focused we are. If we're not in business because you're dragging your feet, paying us, right? So all of that to say, I think this is another opportunity where it comes down to education of the partners you're working with, which ultimately helps them better understand what you need to really become more patient focused in what you're doing right now. Because oftentimes, I think about the old site evaluation questionnaires that you're filling out all the time, and 85% of the questions are the same. Take a lot of time and resources away from actual patient care. But I remember talking with the staff, putting those questionnaires together, and my phone is ringing from regulatory and startup people asking me why so-and-so site wasn't responding to a questionnaire or a CDA fast enough for their liking. And finally, I said, look, here's what we're going to do. I know you haven't participated in a trial. I know you haven't worked at a clinical trial site. Let's go on a field trip. And I started taking groups to sites so they could learn what's a day in the life of a coordinator like, right? So they could actually understand, you're seeing 2 patients. The visits are 90 minutes each. There's an hour of paperwork after each of them. There's prep work in advance. You're getting ready for the monitor, for the audit prep stuff. And there isn't someone usually doing patient recruitment full time. So you're doing that, kind of on the side for funsies, right? And when they had that better understanding of what it was like and how hard coordinators and PIs and site staff really work, they kind of went, maybe we can do a better job of being more site-centric, which lets them focus their efforts on being a little more patient-friendly, right? But how can sites be more patient-friendly? Often it's not always up to you, right? But I think a lot about the logistical challenges faced for clinical trial participation. So let's imagine you're running a study in Parkinson's disease and there's going to be a caregiver component. A lot of sites might be open Monday through Thursday, 10 to 4, 9 to 5, or maybe they're open 5 days a week, but there's substantial breaks throughout the day for whatever reasons in addition to lunch. So you're that caregiver. You, assuming you're working, you're going to have to take time off work. You're going to have to figure out how to get to the site, how to bring the patient to the site who might be confused or agitated. Maybe this site is a decent drive, 2 hours or more away from you. Now you've got to worry about food. You've got to worry about gas. Maybe it's a really detailed visit that includes an overnight. You have to worry about pet sitters, childcare, all these other things, right? So if you have a relationship with a sponsor or a contract research organization where they're looking for feedback on a particular study design, and you're able to share some of these logistical concerns, maybe you don't need to have a decentralized or hybrid clinical trial, but maybe hours can be extended for nights and weekends, for a little more flexibility. There are things like that that are generally easy tweaks if the companies you're partnered with sort of understand the lay of the land and are able to help you accommodate, but they're not things that are easy to do in a vacuum on your own.
Well, that's what I find. It's an interesting dynamic because the as it stands, and I know that things are changing to some degree, but patients are enrolled through the sites.
Yeah,
that's just how it is right now, and the sites have just as much of a vested interest in getting these patients in and making it easy for them as they possibly can, but they get, I think, so little in terms of resources from the literally billion-dollar CROs who are telling you, here, go enroll some patients. Well, okay, so a lot of these things that are being developed as well, the site's not the end user, but the site still has to be involved in the process, but they don't really get to be involved in the decision part or the end user part. They're kind of stuck in the middle, all right? So it creates a bizarre and sometimes challenging position for us because we want the same things that the CROs and sponsors want.
Yeah.
We just don't get the benefit of the resources that they have, unfortunately. And so again, I think that can be very frustrating where, again, what can you do as a site? I know that there's obviously all the hype with DCT and how that, it's helping change things and maybe helping for the better. How do you see the role of sites as decentralization starts to, or not starts, but continues to really kind of propagate throughout the clinical trial industry?
Yeah, I think sites are going to be vital going forwards, And I say that with two different hats on, right? My patient recruitment industry hat outside of Medable. Sites are the key in making sure a trial is successful, right? Without those relationships with patients in your practice and your community, it's just a nightmare to recruit, right? So I don't really see the site component going anywhere. And then from the Medable side, we again are firm believers in the importance of the sites, right? So my colleague Mary Costello runs our site network council. And these are the groups of sites that are able to, share their pain points and things that are keeping them up at night with Mary, the issues they have with e-consent, existing technologies. Oftentimes they're the squeaky wheels, much like I myself am the squeaky wheel in the advocacy space, but ultimately they're the ones that get the grease, right? They're the ones who help shape products and all of these different decisions being made, So there are a million different permutations. I know there are companies like Science 37 who are, going sightless, and maybe it works for some trials, maybe it doesn't for others. But from my perspective and the Medable perspective, I think sites are critical to the success or failure of a trial. So it really kind of behooves everyone to do their part to make sure sites are set up for success and they're getting the resources they need.
Yeah, no, and it's I see some space where maybe sightless trials will work. I can't see that being the norm or even a very large percentage, just knowing what I know from having to run these trials. And I did notice that Medable put together their little site consortium network, whatever you want to call it. I do hats off to you guys for that, because frankly, I think that's the real future, is the partnership between these DCT vendors and sites, because a lot of times, again, sites kind of feel like they're on the outside looking in, or really not even that. They're just standing around waiting for somebody to tell them what to do and not necessarily having a true voice in the matter. So I think it's going to benefit you guys, exponentially to be able to truly take that feedback from sites. And so again, I think that's a really smart initiative. I've talked a little bit to Mary here and there, and given her the same feedback. So I really do applaud you guys for that. And I don't know that that's being utilized nearly as well as it should, or at least not at the level that it should be.
Yeah, I spent a large part of my career before I went to the site side working to identify high performing sites and then to actually build strategic site relationships with them, right? And it was all about figuring out, what do you need? How can we work more effectively together? I know CROs can be a pain in the butt. How do we make that interaction more streamlined, right? And then eventually I went to the site side, building those relationships on behalf of the high performing site network with sponsors, with CROs. It's all about having that dialogue, again, the two-way street, having the conversation. And sometimes maybe it's not a pleasant one, but often if it's not pleasant, it's a reflection of, we're maybe not doing what we need to for the sites that we're ultimately relying on to recruit patients. So it's a conversation that needs to be had. And ultimately, I think it can lead to more productive partnerships, right? When you talk about building site relationships on behalf of the CRO, right? I did a lot of that when interferon-free hepatitis C treatments were being developed, right? So like 2012 to 14-ish, I guess. And there were all of these large phase 3 programs going on at once. I think at one point there were 4 or 5 trials I was looking at. And I was absolutely talking about, the benefit of working in Asia Pac and Eastern Europe and Latin America to supplement all the work being done in Western Europe and North America. But sponsors would say, okay, we want to work with high performing sites in the US. And I'd say, well, look, there's a finite number of them. There's a finite number of patients. What are you going to do to make sure when Brad is presented with 3 trial options for the same patient pool, everything being equal, to make him choose to work with you, right? And there was a lot of head scratching and twiddling of thumbs. And I said, well, why don't you start talking to sites and figure out what they need to really be successful and to really thrive here? Part of it can be some resources. I think there were some organizations that were providing dedicated CRCs at the time. But you had sites who would say, look, we want to get involved in conversations with sponsors for bid defenses to share our expertise and our knowledge. For planning purposes, we're a strategic partner. Can you give us a look at what's in your pipeline, what's coming up in the next 3, 6, 12, 18 months so we can plan accordingly, And it wasn't at that point the usual way of operating. I'm hopeful it's become more common these days. But I think it really took some of that education and awareness building of, this is what sites do. This is a reminder of why they're so critical to the success or failure of your trial. This is what they need to really do their job without unnecessary burden. So when we're talking about designing a smarter trial, it involves not only removing burden from patients, but from the sites as well, so they can do their thing,
Well, that's what I find interesting as a site is like, I'm happy to take on the burden to a large degree, right? That's what I see our job is to help take that burden for the patient and make it as easy as possible for them. It's just that, there's not always the resources or, financial compensation that comes along with that. And I'll tell you this, you look at a clinical trial budget as a site, it does not matter how much or how highly you're able to negotiate that budget, you're going to come across 100 unforeseen costs that come along with doing it. And again, that makes it very challenging. And it to speak kind of to the other point, it creates a situation where the studies that are easiest to enroll are going to get all the action and the rest are going to fall by the wayside because you have to put time, energy, and resources towards something. It might as well be the one that's easiest to execute and pays the best. And again, that's a conversation I had with somebody, and that I'm like, look, unfortunately, that's the nature of the beast because, like you said, sites have very little operating capital. They're not necessarily, there are exceptions to that. There's some nice big private equity backed sites and site networks, and those exist. But there's also a lot of people like me that are sort of in smaller regional networks that they're building, and it can be the difference between success and failure if you can't go out there and produce for your sponsor or CRO. So I think that becomes again a very challenging thing to prioritize, especially when you're talking about livelihoods and quality of life of patients. You don't want to have to make that decision to enroll one patient over another just because the resources and compensation happen to be better.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess it all comes back to varying degrees of awareness or varying kinds of awareness, right? So I don't know how many times over the years when I was working in feasibility, I'd have a conversation with a super sharp medical team that had been working in the field for 25 years at a sponsor or a CRO. And oftentimes, they hadn't seen a patient since they finished their training 20 or 25 years ago. And they were so laser focused on creating a protocol that was of scientific interest and it was, groundbreaking, this, that, and the other. And they didn't really think about what the impact would be, number one, on sites. Number two, they didn't think about how burdensome they were making patient recruitment and participation. And it's the kind of thing where, it happens to me all the time. I'm not a scientist, I'm not creating protocols, but I was working with a group of patients last year. We were testing out a sensor for an oncology trial, and we had some time. A couple of the patients I was working with were patients with various forms of cancer, and they said, yeah, send me a couple of the devices. And we got some feedback, which was really impactful. But what really stuck with me, and it's never would have occurred to me, I'm embarrassed to say, one of my friends said, this device is meant to be used in trials where patients are probably on active treatment. Their body composition is going to change. Their weight's going to fluctuate. This thing's not adjustable. And I kind of went, oh my God, and you were just so focused on whether this was the right technology to implement that you didn't really think about what it would actually look like for patients. And, it's the same thing with protocol design. You're trying to design something that's of scientific interest and curiosity, sites can recruit for as well. Ultimately, it ticks the boxes for the investigational product you're working to develop. But if you create something that is so unappealing to the sites, well, got a big problem right there.
Yeah, and unfortunately, it's not uncommon to, you look at a protocol and you're like, great, this looks great. We're going to do 1,000 patients. Well, you start looking through patients and you realize there's this one or two things that are going to kick out 90% of your patients that you maybe didn't really know until you started getting down into the nuts and bolts, into the guts of the protocol. And then you say, well, this isn't what the patients look like. This is not what your normal patient looks like. Maybe you need it to be this way so that, you are more likely to get your drug approved. But Unfortunately, this is not what the real life patient looks like. And then at that point, you start to really throw your hands in the air. And that's a problem I see, over and over again, So yeah, it's and I don't know how to necessarily always solve that problem because you can't run a study till you run a study, right? Or at least maybe if the sponsors and CROs would be a little more willing to go back quickly to the drawing board when they see there's a problem and say, oh, okay, let's make an amendment and fix this. And I think that alone would take care of a big percentage of your enrollment issues, that exist out there, in my opinion.
So that's a great point, the amendment aspect, right? Often I'm thinking about how to qualify and quantify the impact of incorporating the patient perspective. And Ken Getz shared some really fantastic data at Patients as Partners back in April about the number of amendments you can avoid by, gathering the patient perspective early and often. But I'm a big proponent of doing the same thing with sites, right? So you have a protocol concept. It's not even a synopsis yet. Let's talk to some clinicians we work with. We've got trusted relationships with to learn what are we missing? What red flags are they seeing? What do we need to beef up? What can we really streamline? How can we make this a more site-friendly protocol? And, making sure that it's friendly for patients as well. We'll tick in all the boxes. Hopefully you can avoid the need for amendment at all by designing something that's correct the first time. And, there are some things you can't account for. I was working on a dry eye study a couple of years back. I think we imagined there was going to be, based on historical data, 10 or 12% that would screen fail. And I remember talking with the sponsor one day and they were a little perplexed, a little angry because they found out a couple sites were having 50, 55% of patients screen fail. And these were sites we worked with all the time. So I said, okay, let me look into this. And it was one of these things that you just could not account for. They had a screening requirement where patients could not have hepatitis B or C. So there was testing. Okay, see that all the time. But the particular tests they were using often came back with an inconclusive result. And the protocol did not let you retest. So you had like a tremendous amount of patients probably did not have hepatitis that could easily participate in the trial, were eager to participate, that were just kind of floating in the ether. There was no way to move ahead without amending the protocol. I think ultimately they wound up months and months behind schedule, and they might have eventually scrapped it. But those things you can amend as the need arises, but everything else comes down to planning and having those conversations with your networks of sites, your patient councils, and doing it throughout the entire duration of clinical development.
Sure. Nope. That sounds, I agree. I'm going to take a sharp segue here and
go for it.
Something else I like to ask all my guests is, selfishly, it's kind of for me, I'm always interested in what sorts of tools and resources people use to help do their jobs better, whether that be a book that, you take a lot away from, or an app, or a podcast, or a time management system. It doesn't have to be clinical research specific, whatever the case may be, but I'm always interested in how people can better optimize the work that they do. So, what are some things that maybe you'd share that help you be the best Richie you can be?
Yeah, absolutely, man. I'm struggling. I'm trying to get there. I'm doing better, I think. One of the things that really helps, particularly as my vision goes, is listening more. I'm not someone who's worked in advocacy forever. I'm really fortunate. I get to work with just a tremendous group of really badass advocates, patients, and caregivers. So just listening and learning from them is immensely helpful. The other thing that comes to mind, I'm not sure if you're familiar with human-centered design, but it's something I'm getting more and more into. I just completed my first course yesterday from IDEO, some of the leaders in the field of human-centered design. But that helps me reframe how I look at questions or problems I'm trying to solve. It helps me, really frame insights that will drive some interest, will spur some conversation, will ultimately lead to the design team I work with crafting something awesome, So different ways of looking at things, and then just learning from different experiences. There's so many people who have been in research for a lot longer than I have, or have been in for a shorter period of time, but have experienced some really wild stuff. So networking, I think, would be the final thing, right? Learning from all of them, hearing all the crazy stories they have to bring to the table here. There's always an opportunity to learn, and that helps me do better, right? I'm never going to be the smartest guy in the room. I'm never going to have all the answers, but I'm willing to listen. I'm willing to say, I don't know, let me get back to you. And I'm willing to follow up. So, that's sort of my MO here.
Yeah, and if you network well, you don't always have to learn everything the hard way. Yeah, that's something that I try to take into account as I'm networking with people, is that there's just such a breadth of knowledge out there, especially on LinkedIn, where I think we met. I'm just blown away every day by how many people are on there in the clinical research industry who are sharing experiences and engaging in interesting and important conversations. I mean, if you're not out there, get out there and start being a part of these conversations, because you can really sort of level up a lot more quickly by listening to the people out there who are out there fighting the good fight and helping progress move along. So I love that. I'm a terrible networker, frankly. I'm an introvert. I'm a quiet guy. I like to keep to myself. But once I sort of was able to flip that switch, opened up a lot of doors, and really helped change the way I view things, and help my perspective along. So it's something I still have to remind myself to do all the time.
Yeah, I'm in the same boat. Being in sales for a while got me to be able to flip the switch as well. But I think you really captured the idea nicely, right? It's not just being out there, but it's participating in these conversations. There's a lot to learn, but there's a lot of insight that you can share as well for others to learn from. So don't be afraid to have those conversations and engage in that dialogue.
I love it. Where can people find you online?
Man, I'm on LinkedIn, I'm on Twitter, and I'm on richiekahn.wordpress.com. So the LinkedIn, I think, is just Richie Kahn or Richie-Kahn. Twitter is R-Balticon, Baltikahn. It's a lot of health policy, a lot of advocacy stuff, patient experience, and I've got my own hashtag glaucomaniac.
Love
As
it.
a good optic atrophy patient I am. But I'm always happy to connect.
Very cool. We'll make sure that we get your contact information on our show notes. And anything else before we part ways?
Just really appreciate the opportunity to chat, Brad. I'm glad our paths crossed and we were actually able to sync up in real time. On Clubhouse, I guess, a couple months back. And big fan of the pod. Looking forward to seeing this episode going live.
Well, we'll let you know, man. I appreciate you coming on, and we'll talk again soon. Thanks, Richie.
Thanks, Brad. Take it easy. Stay well.
Thank you for listening to the Note to File podcast. All show notes, episode transcripts, and contact information can be found at notetofilepodcast.com. And again, please don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe. Thanks again for listening.